Ice Radio. It's very nice to have you with us here today. We are coming to you from Sweden in Scandinavia. And as you know, our website is redicecreations.com, R-E-D-I-C-E, creations.com. And today we are going to talk about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and we are going to, I guess in a sense, shatter the consensus image that I think most people have about Mozart, which some have even dubbed the Freemasonic composer. We have Robert Newman with us here on the line today, who will be releasing a book on this subject somewhere at the end of the summer, probably. And Robert has been studying this for quite some time, and we're going to get into this other side of Mozart. We're going to see how this image, as it were, of him has been created, this pivotal composer and a genius image, so to speak, that we have of Mozart at this point. So this is going to be really interesting program. So I hope you keep your eyes pierced, as it were, here. Welcome to the program, Robert. Thank you very much for coming on Red Ice Radio.
Well, thank you very much, Henrik. It's a pleasure to be with you and to share these insights and these discoveries with your good self and with your listeners.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, Robert. How long have you been studying this particular subject? And also tell us how you first got into this and how did your interest in Mozart first begin?
Well, I'm originally from Scotland, and as a youth, and later, especially during my studies in London, when I studied music, I was as enamored with Mozart as almost any person could be. I wouldn't say fanatical, but I was blown away by the sheer beauty and the depth and the wonder of his music, to the point where I wanted, I suppose if you love something, you want to understand it more, or at least you want to bring yourself closer to it. So I began reading the standard biographies, of which there are many, of course, and building up over years, and I'm now in my early 50s, a knowledge of Mozart and an understanding of Mozart, an appreciation of Mozart. He tends to be, he's a kind of person who can draw you in. You know, the sheer volume, the scale of the correspondence, the number of his pieces, the dramatic nature of his life, etc. All of these tend to be something of a secular religion, in fact, and it's studied internationally. You have huge conferences discussing almost every aspect of his life and career. And so over a period, I looked perhaps more closely than other people, but it gradually emerged that there were serious inconsistencies with what one is reading and what may actually be the fact of the matter. And not least in the suppression of a great number of composers whose names are hardly known today, who lived at the same time and interacted with him, etc. And then it became obvious that, and that's indisputable, is the number of works which have been falsely attributed to Mozart since his death in 1791, running into hundreds and hundreds of symphonies, concertos, masses, even operas, which are attributed to Mozart but later deleted from successive versions of the Kirchhoff catalogue. So I was approaching it from that aspect, that how can such a colossal group of misattributions feature in the life and career of this person? And this fascinated me, and I was determined to start making notes, which I did 15 years ago, but with no idea, really, of what I would uncover. And only in the last 5 years or so have I really started to uncover major discrepancies and facts which I can only describe as being suppressed by the mainstream Mozart industry, which incidentally, as you may know, is a multi-million-dollar industry, and spin-offs into recording industry, the tourist industry, the chocolate industry, and everything else. So you start to question the consensus, but you don't leave it there. And I came to a point where I thought, yes, this is now capable of being expressed coherently in the form of a critical book against Mozart and his myth.
What were some of the things that first got your eyes open to this? Do you remember some of the discrepancies that you stumbled upon, so to speak, when you were researching Mozart?
I think the biggest thing is the suppression of evidence. The suppression of information can sometimes be as damaging as propaganda itself. And that was one aspect. There are manuscripts today in various libraries and museums, archives, which have the name of Mozart written on them, although we know for certain that they're actually written by other composers. And this scandal continues even to this day. In Modena, sorry, yeah.
I just wanted to ask, do you have any example of some of these the compositions that aren't Mozart's?
I would go as far as to say, and here's the first shock of our conversation, that Mozart, the real Mozart, wrote probably half a dozen works in his entire life.
Okay.
Half a dozen. The rest, if that. Mozart was a musician of no great talent. He was a provincial musician. A provincial musician being propelled, falsified on a scale that is almost is difficult for us to believe. It's difficult for us to understand that the works of the plays of William Shakespeare may not have been written by William Shakespeare, but people have been saying this for 300 and 400 years.
Yes.
And we really must at some point start to say, what is the alternative? And it's this alternative that I'd like to put forward and sustain by, if necessary, with the source documents that can support this view.
Yes. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the sources. You mentioned here to me before that you, and there's also other people around the world who have been following this story and have been researching this as well. Isn't that right?
That's correct, yes. Last year, for example, 2008, was publication of a book on the marriage of Figaro. You know, the marriage of Figaro is about as big as it gets in Mozart's musical reputation. An opera that was premiered in Vienna on the 1st of May 1786, a world-famous opera. Surely this has to be by Mozart, but it isn't. It isn't by Mozart. And nor is Don Giovanni, nor is Così fan tutte, and nor is the Magic Flute, the Zauberflöte. This is extraordinary. And each of these things would require some time, but of the 41 symphonies attributed to Mozart, of the 41, hardly one of them is by Mozart. The 27 piano concertos today attributed to Mozart, we know already, and this is already recognized, that the first 7 of them are actually arrangements by other composers. They're not by Mozart at all. So the explanation for this, again, I'm happy to provide.
Yes, absolutely. Let's definitely get into here a little bit later. And what are some of the sources then that you've been looking into? And are you saying also that these are sources that are kind of widely available for people to look into themselves, but this hasn't just been brought to attention or brought to light? Is that what you're saying?
Correct. If you take, for example, the symphonies, there's a biography by a man named Maynard Solomon. It's a famous biography of Mozart. On the page 503, footnote 20, he goes on to say that not a single one of Mozart's first 25 symphonies show any evidence of being attributable to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. I mean, when you start getting into Mozart by the kilo, then you start to realize that the childhood of Mozart was hugely exaggerated and falsified. You must remember that these events were not taking place in public. They were taking place across Europe, a Europe which was already predisposed to Mozart because of the Holy Roman Empire. And that's exactly the context within which these things took place. Mm-hmm. The Rosicrucians and the Freemasons, and later the Illuminati. All of these secret organizations, these fraternities, supported the Mozart myth, for their own reasons, and this is able to be documented, and we're able to show this very clearly. The scale of exaggeration involved, plus, of course, the suppression of the career of Nan Errol Mozart, who was his sister.
Yes.
She was 5 years older than him. She was a formidable pianist, but nobody mentions her, of course. Mozart himself was no genius. He was no genius even as a pianist. In fact, his Vienna years as a pianist were entirely falsified. You can have, in the years of his Vienna career, 1783, 1784, he was in Vienna for 2 years at this point, and according to his correspondence, he was in huge demand as a soloist. Over Lent period, in 1784, he staged 3 concertos with 176 patrons buying tickets and so forth. But the closer you study this, the more you realize it's actually untrue. This is being stage managed. And the historians of the time, take, for example, Heinrich Koch. Heinrich Koch, C-O-C-H, was the musicologist living in Vienna at that time. He wrote a book on piano that involved the deal with piano concertos in 1793. He never once mentions Mozart. Nowhere. Nowhere does he talk about him whatsoever. Mozart was completely unknown, except for the elites who sponsored and patronized him, of course, many of them being members of the same fraternities. This is not a public composer. This is a private composer, unknown to the world, and whose image was largely constructed after his untimely death in December of 1791. In fact, in his lifetime, only 3 symphonies of Mozart, inverted commas, were actually published. 3 of the 41. Mm-hmm. And of the 27 piano concertos of, inverted commas, Mozart, only 5 of these were published in his lifetime. And none of them are by Mozart. So I really, when we talk about exaggeration, there's surely a limit between exaggeration and wholesale deception. I think we're talking about the latter.
So let's go back and talk a little bit about some of the, Mozart's childhood, as it were, his upbringing, because again, many people have this idea that he's almost like a savant, a genius. He's like 5 years old and he's an expert at the piano from the get-go. And where does this story come from, so to speak? Do you know that?
Yes, it comes from the prevailing philosophy of the elites at that time, which was, of course, Voltaire and Rousseau. These 2 French, everything had to be French at this time. The influence of French philosophy was considerable before the French Revolution. You can see this reflected in the operas that were staged in Vienna at that time. Rousseau and Voltaire, believe it or not, there were busts to Voltaire, there was a bust to Rousseau in the office of the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg, Colloredo. They were devoted supporters of Rousseau's philosophy, and Rousseau's philosophy, incidentally, after the French Revolution, was imposed on France, and it was Rousseau who believed in this innocent childhood and the noble savage, and Mozart was an experiment. He was an experiment. He was the creation of a musical Superman. The creation of a musical Superman brought to its maximum extent by traversing the Holy Roman Empire, as Maria Theresa said, like a beggar. Going from court to... Now, if you ask yourself, how could Leopold Mozart, his father, have arranged